After more than 5 years, it seems like Death Stranding is finally gaining the respect it always deserved. Back in 2019, most players weren't ready for a slowly paced Kojima experience. However, since then a lot has changed both within the video game industry and society as a whole. The PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series consoles are more than halfway through their life cycles, yet there's only been a handful of games that have truly pushed these machines to their limit. Meanwhile, that list of games becomes even smaller if you're looking for something that wasn't broken or missing content at launch. On top of underwhelming AAA games, we've also been through a global pandemic, a surge in algorithms designed to steal our attention, the introduction of AI tools that continue to get better with each passing day, and several more cultural changes that other YouTubers have made careers out of. Shoutout Big Tug. All of these factors, along with just time passing by, has completely rewired people's brains, changing their preferences and most importantly, their patience. I'm willing to argue that the rise of TikTok and the oversaturation of short-form content has pushed people to seek out slower and more refined experiences, which is why over the years Death Stranding's reputation has rebounded, and ahead of its sequel, thousands of gamers have either returned to the first game in order to give it a second chance, or they've decided to play Death Stranding for the first time. In light of this, everyone, including myself, has realized that they've been lied to about the game's reputation. If you want to argue whether or not Death Stranding is a walking simulator, go ahead and check out my last video, which goes over why that label is incorrect and why that game is one of the best ever made. If you're watching, there's probably a good chance that you've already fallen in love with not just the world, visuals, and traversal mechanics featured in Death Stranding, but also the addictive mission setups that continuously give players valuable rewards for their time and effort. But arguably the most special aspect of Death Stranding, and why it's worthy of having its own unique game genre, is due to its truly unique form of multiplayer. Before the game was released, Kojima publicly said that Death Stranding would be the first Strand-Type game, but he never really explained what he meant by that. To this day, people still think that Kojima was just being narcissistic with what he said, but in reality there's no other game out there that has the same multiplayer design as Death Stranding. For all intents and purposes, Death Stranding is designed as a single-player experience only, but in reality there is a huge emphasis on connecting with others, not just with its story and themes, but with its gameplay. Players will never come face to face on their journeys across America, however the choices they make along the way will be felt by everyone else who plays Death Stranding. This is most obviously expressed by the player-built structures and tools that have been placed around the world for others to use, but other decisions are felt too, like dirt roads that form based on the foot traffic of players from around the world. It's a system that was clearly inspired by Soulsborne games where players can leave messages in order to help those who may be inexperienced. But even then, I wouldn't label Dark Souls or any other FromSoft game as a Strand-Type. In those games, you have to go out of your way to leave a message or engage with the multiplayer, but in Death Stranding, you don't really have a choice. Sure, if for some reason you want to purposely avoid any structures or tools left by other players, you can, but any ladders, ropes, or generators you place down will end up helping someone else on their journey. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no other game that features this kind of asynchronous multiplayer, meaning that Death Stranding remains the only Strand-Type. So all of the games I'll discuss in this video lack that multiplayer element that defines the Strand-Type genre, but all of them in their own unique way will feel familiar to anyone who enjoys Death Stranding, its atmosphere, themes, and mechanics. The first game I'll point you to in this video is ironically the recently released sequel, Death Stranding 2. Yeah, I know, it's pretty obvious that if you like the first game, then you should try out the sequel, but it's important to mention that while structurally the sequel is almost identical to the original, there have been several changes made for those who may have not enjoyed their time with the first game. However, if you're someone who absolutely loved the first Death Stranding, its sequel might not be everything that you wanted. A change in Death Stranding 2 that can be felt instantly, and one that I think we can all appreciate, is the pacing. One of the biggest complaints that people had for the first game was the inconsistent pacing, and that's something Kojima has fixed with the sequel arguably too well. In the first Death Stranding, there are 14 episodes, and there's about 70 main delivery missions for Sam to complete. However, more than half of them, 38 to be exact, take place in the first 3 episodes. From my experience, it took me about 16 hours just to reach Chapter 5. Meanwhile, in Death Stranding 2, I reached Chapter 6 by the 10-hour mark. Both games set their opening hours in a separate open world, which is much smaller and less diverse than the ones players will explore later in the game. In the original Death Stranding, the first 6 to 8 hours will take place in the northeast part of America, and while this location is visually stunning at first, the game traps players in this area for way too long. I talked about it in my last video, but this area doesn't have a lot of biome diversity, and it can quickly become stale paired with constant backtracking. On the other hand, Death Stranding 2 sets its opening hours in Mexico, which is not only more diverse, but most players will spend less than 3 hours in this location. Additionally, players unlock and see more within the first 3 hours of Death Stranding 2 than they did in the first dozen or so hours in the original. For instance, Guns are given to the players in the very first mission of the second game, whereas it takes over a dozen hours to unlock firearms in the first Death Stranding. There's more than that too. It takes players more than 5 hours to unlock vehicles in the first game. Meanwhile, players get access to a vehicle within the first 3 hours of Death Stranding 2, on top of having the first boss encounter, which will take you 6 to 7 hours to reach in the first game. The sequel does not waste your time whatsoever, as backtracking has significantly been reduced, and quality of life improvements have been made anywhere players could have asked for. A lot of the gameplay has been dumbed down and simplified compared to the original. For instance, the first Death Stranding had multiple different mechanical legs for different functions, like speed or strength. Meanwhile, the sequel only features one set of mechanical legs, which serves multiple functions. If you loved the unique soul and atmosphere of the first game, sadly, Death Stranding 2 has gone somewhat in a different direction, but if I'm being honest with you, that's not a bad thing at all. I love the foreboding and depressing atmosphere present in the first game that takes place in a world without hope. And while there are plenty of tongue-in-cheek moments in the first game, everything is played pretty straight. Now, Death Stranding 2 takes place in a new, hopeful world after Sam connected the entirety of America 11 months prior. With this, Kojima has made the game far more wacky and over the top compared to before. It's not like Sam's cracking jokes like he's in a Marvel movie. Norman Reedus is still playing the role pretty seriously. However, everyone and everything around him is showing more character and having more fun than before. Death Stranding 2 still touches on some seriously dark and depressing subject matter, but once you enter the outback of Australia, things quickly spiral into comedic gold. Kojima's brand of humor definitely isn't for everyone, and even I had moments of saying what the fuck out loud, but I can't lie to you, the characters are incredibly charming and I spent literally hours just smiling at the screen. Objectively, Death Stranding 2 is a perfect sequel and does literally everything better than the first game. The plot has a greater emphasis than before, with genuinely charming characters and memorable moments. The vistas, visuals, and the graphics present, along with the stellar performance, makes this one of the best next-gen experiences on the PlayStation 5. The gameplay has also taken a dramatic shift. Although Traversal is still the main gameplay mechanic, which hasn't seen many changes outside of refinement, and while the BT stealth sections function almost identically compared to the last game, combat and stealth against humans has been improved significantly. Thanks to the game not wasting your time in the opening hours, as well as Death Stranding 2's perfect progression system, you have plenty of open-ended options in handling human and cybernetic encounters. You can roleplay Sam as a hardened soldier who shoots first and asks questions later, or you can pretend to be a scared little bitch who slowly crawls past and through enemy encampments. But if you're anything like me, you'll end up handling most encounters with an aggressive stealth approach, until you finally are spotted and either turn into a super soldier or run for the hills. I'm definitely not the first person to make this comparison at all, and it's really obvious once you start throwing Dollman into the air to tag enemies, but Death Stranding 2's stealth and action gameplay feels extremely reminiscent of Kojima's last Metal Gear Solid game, The Phantom Pain. So yes, the first two games in this video that scratch that Death Stranding itch are its sequel and its director's last game before it. There's a really good chance that if you played Death Stranding, you have most likely already played The Phantom Pain, which is 10 years old at this point. Jesus fucking Christ. So for the sake of this video, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about The Phantom Pain, and I'll definitely go over it again in a future video. If you enjoyed putting down your backpack, scouting out and dispatching a base full of enemies in Death Stranding 2, and you haven't played Metal Gear Solid 5, you have to. That's literally the main gameplay loop. Yes, the game is nearly a decade old, but it still has some of the deepest and most immersive stealth mechanics we have ever seen, both of which put the gameplay in Death Stranding 2 to shame. Still, The Phantom Pain is technically not a Strand-like, as there isn't a seamless multiplayer mechanic. However, outside of the Kojima-directed combat and stealth, there are still other mechanics that are reminiscent of Death Stranding. Specifically, Kojima has always been a master of gameplay progression. Metal Gear Solid 5 really lacks a true compelling story, as it easily has the lowest cutscene to gameplay ratio in the series, and although The Phantom Pain is easily the most divisive Metal Gear entry due to its unfinished narrative, it still has an incredibly large and strong fanbase, not just because of the gameplay, but also because of the gameplay progression. Like the Death Stranding games, which give you worthwhile and meaningful rewards for completing both main and side delivery missions, Metal Gear Solid 5 did the same thing all the way back in 2015. You will get sucked into this game and lose literally hours of your life as you continuously tell yourself you're only going to accept one more operation. But then, after you complete your mission, you unlock a boatload of new upgrades, equipment, vehicles, weapons, buddies, and more. Just like Death Stranding, Metal Gear Solid 5 does get better and better the further you go along, which makes it really hard to put down once you get into a good flow. But again, I'm gonna assume that you've already played one of the best games, not just from the previous generation, but of all time. Now, let's move on and cover some games that function differently than a Kojima production, yet each one I introduce will be immersively familiar to some of his best works. The first of which was mentioned in the comment section of my last video, with Retro Jan going on to inspire the creation of this video, so thank you very much for that. Shadow of the Colossus is one of the many all-time great games that was released on the PlayStation 2, and it has always remained relatively popular, receiving a remaster on the PlayStation 3 and a full-on remake on the PlayStation 4. It's a game that's been covered countless times on YouTube, and if you haven't given it a chance yet, don't let its age deter you from playing. While Shadow of the Colossus is officially 20 years old, its stripped-back gameplay design has aged quite gracefully. For the most part, there are no HUD elements, only displaying the health bar for Colossi whenever you damage them, and a stamina gauge whenever you are climbing. There is a story, but like Death Stranding, the gameplay is the real focus as it services the narrative. In Shadow of the Colossus, you play as a young man in a fantasy world who has brought his dead lover to an isolated and abandoned region of their realm in hopes of bringing her back to life. It turns out he can, but in order to do so, he has to go on to defeat 16 different towering colossi. That's pretty much it. After the setup, the game points you in the direction of the next giant to slay, in which you will travel there both on horseback and on foot, defeat them before doing it all over again. Just like Death Stranding, Shadow of the Colossus places a huge emphasis on exploration and breathtaking landscapes, all while including over-the-top and bombastic boss fights. Obviously, it's not a direct comparison, but both games have similarities, especially in how lonely and empty exploring the worlds can be. And while Death Stranding is all about connecting the world, Shadow of the Colossus seems to be about destroying our connection with the world, and the consequences that can entail. Following the release of Shadow of the Colossus, Team Ico immediately began production of their next game. 4 years later, at E3 2009, Sony revealed The Last Guardian, the next Team Ico game that aimed for a holiday 2011 release. But soon, talks of the game went quiet, with most people assuming that the game would never be released and stay stuck in development hell. There were numerous issues going on behind the scenes, mostly due to the limited power and difficulty working with the PlayStation 3 architecture, while also running into programming issues for Trico, the half-bird, half-mammal, dog-like creature. Development of The Last Guardian was tumultuous as it was delayed multiple times, and it resulted in the death of the Team Ico studio. Eventually, development of the game was shifted over to the studio Gen Design, which was made up of many former Team Ico employees. The game was also moved to the PlayStation 4, and surprisingly to everyone, the game was officially re-announced in 2015 and released the following year. Before making this video, I'd never given The Last Guardian a chance, nor had I heard anyone really talking about this game. Let me just say that I was thoroughly surprised when I played this game for the first time. It is incredibly immersive and well made. Like the previous works, The Last Guardian has little to no HUD elements for most of the game, only using tutorial pop-ups to explain certain gameplay mechanics. The game begins with our main character, a young boy waking up in a cell of a ruined castle, directly next to an enormous creature which is called Trico. It's clear from the jump that the creature is not friendly, however, since he is chained up and also injured, the boy is safe as long as he keeps his distance. But eventually, through some brilliant programming and game design, the boy ends up helping and befriending the creature. I'm so serious, this is one of the best openings to a game that I have ever played. It's very slow and you have to be patient to enjoy it, but I can completely understand why this game was in development hell because they programmed the shit out of this dog, cat, bird-like creature. It's really hard to put into words, and you just have to experience it for yourself because Trico feels genuinely real, and the programmers give you multiple different ways to interact with him. You can feed him, climb on him, pet him, and give him several different commands, and Trico is programmed to have multiple different responses and reactions depending on the circumstance. Like raising and training a dog in real life, you have to be patient and learn how to control Trico. Again, this game isn't for everyone, but if you can appreciate the more quiet moments in Death Stranding or Shadow of the Colossus, then this game is a no-brainer. It is pure cinema, and besides the brilliant programming and game design, the visuals and set pieces will fully wow you. If you have a PlayStation Plus Extra membership, you should have access to download this game for free, but even not, I still think the opening moments of this game alone are worth $20. It is incredibly impressive what the game developers were able to create, and it's a shame that we haven't seen a new game from them since. The penultimate game in this video is incredibly similar to the previous two, and surprisingly, this wasn't created by the same developers. Stray is a game that many of you might be familiar with as it was only released 2 to 3 years ago, with many going on to call this game Death Stranding but with cats. In this game, you evidently play as a cat, specifically an orange one who falls into a walled-off, post-apocalyptic, cyberpunk-inspired city. It's then your main goal to find your way back to the surface, discovering robot inhabitants and hostile bacteria in a wonderfully designed platformer. Unlike many of the previous games, aside from maybe The Last Guardian, Stray is probably the closest one on this list to being a genuine walking simulator. Technically, it's a platformer as you'll jump across rooftops and onto ledges while also using other forms of transportation, but still, the main thing you'll be doing is walking throughout the underground city while solving puzzles. Stray is still a well-made comfort game that anyone can really enjoy, especially if you love cats, but one thing you should all know is that this game is incredibly short. Specifically, when I first beat this game about 2 years ago, I finished it in 3 hours and 30 minutes, which is typical for most first-time playthroughs. But if you ever decide to play this game for a second time, you'll most likely finish it in under 2 hours, and even then, I don't think there's any reason to double down on it outside of trophies. I don't want to sound like I hate this game. I was absolutely enthralled the first time I played this game, and it's incredibly well made by a small studio. However, when I did play it, I didn't have to pay for it. Now, it's off of PlayStation Plus, and at the moment, it's $30, and I don't know if I can confidently recommend it at that price point unless you really love cats. Finally, the last game I'll be covering in this video is probably the most similar to Death Stranding in terms of having traversal as a main mechanic, yet it's probably the one that only a few of you will even know about. Just a few days ago, at the time of writing this script, I didn't even know what Shoutout was, or if I'm even pronouncing it right, but in my hunt for a game similar to Death Stranding, I discovered this game on Steam during the summer sales event. Shoutout is an indie game through and through, with the occasional janky moment, but it's still very impressive to see how far the scale and scope of indie games has become. Like many of the other games before it, Shoutout takes place in a post-apocalyptic setting that seems to be in a severe drought. Our main character decides to climb an enormous desolate tower which is split up into different biomes and filled with remnants of a lost civilization. It's a gorgeous game, but unfortunately there isn't much of a story to speak of. There's no dialogue, and any resemblance of a story is left for letters and notes that can be picked up throughout the world, which I'll be honest, I didn't read a single one. But the story isn't the main focus at all in Shoutout, and if you couldn't tell by the footage in front of you, this game is really a rock climbing simulator. I played the game on PC, but it's highly recommended that you play with a controller, so I did. And just like Death Stranding, which uses the triggers to keep balance, Shoutout uses the triggers to climb. At first, I thought this would feel really clunky and unintuitive, but surprisingly it's butter smooth and you can actually climb pretty fast. But that's pretty much all that the game has to offer. It's a rock climbing simulator that takes you up an incredibly tall tower with different biomes and some incredibly stunning visuals for an indie game. Right now, it's on sale for $12 on Steam, and if this game sounds or looks interesting to you, then don't hesitate to support a small indie developer. Overall, I try to mention similar games to Death Stranding that maybe you wouldn't initially think of. There's plenty of honorable mentions to go around, like Red Dead Redemption 2, which is probably Death Stranding's only real competitor in terms of environmental design. Then you also have Skyrim, which yes, this wouldn't be a proper video game video essay without mentioning Skyrim at least once, but I think it's fair with the similar sense of awe and adventure present in Death Stranding. Originally I was going to give Steep its own section too, but when I loaded it up to capture footage for this video, the servers weren't even working, and it's a real shame because Steep is a well-made game, but fuck Ubisoft. Of course, if you want to be a smartass, you can go ahead and recommend some good walking simulator or even a truck driving game. But all in all, that's about it for this video. If you enjoyed, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you aren't already. My next video will be coming out in less than 2 weeks, and I'll be covering the single player experience in Ready or Not. Again, thank you all so much for watching. Keep on keeping on.